Miller family moved into their new home with excitement, hoping for a fresh start. It was an old, stately house on the outskirts of town. Big, a little worn, but full of charm. For the Millers, it was perfect. But what they didn't know was that the house had a history, one that would not stay buried. The first few nights were peaceful. The creaks of the old house settling, the groaning pipes, these were things they could explain. But soon, those normal sounds were joined by something else. Every night at exactly 1:13 a.m., a low, distant noise would rise from the basement. At first, it was barely audible, like the soft hum of machinery. Over time, it grew louder, evolving into what sounded like faint whispers, as if someone, no, multiple people, were speaking all at once. Then, those voices became something even more terrifying. Cries. At first, Mr. Miller tried to explain it away. "It's just the plumbing," he said, though his own voice wavered. But as the nights went on, the sounds became unmistakable. Pleading, tortured voices that would begin as a distant murmur and slowly swell into desperate cries for help. One night, when the noise seemed especially loud, they could hear distinct words echoing up through the floorboards. "Help us. Please. We're trapped." Mrs. Miller shuddered, clutching her blanket tighter. Their teenage son, Kyle, who had always been the skeptic, stood frozen by the basement door, staring at the dark wooden stairs that led down below. The air felt heavy, like something was watching them from the shadows. "We have to do something," Mrs. Miller finally whispered. "We can't just ignore it." After a long discussion, the Millers decided to set up cameras in the basement to capture the source of the sounds. They needed to know if they were dealing with a leaky pipe, an animal, or something worse. The family gathered their equipment and nervously set it up, every step down into the cold basement making them more uneasy. The space felt suffocating, filled with a damp chill that crawled under their skin. The basement itself was large but empty, except for a few scattered boxes from the previous owners and a strange patch of uneven brick on one of the walls, almost as if it had been hastily repaired. No machinery, no animals, nothing to explain the terrifying noises that had been haunting them. With the cameras in place, they retreated upstairs, dreading what they might uncover. The next night, as expected, the noises began again. This time, the family sat together, nervously watching the live feed from the cameras. The basement was dark, the cameras picking up only the faintest movement of dust in the air. For a while there was nothing, just silence. Then, at exactly 1:13 a.m., the voices started. Low, indistinct murmurs. "Turn up the volume," Mr. Miller said, his voice tight. As they increased the sound, the voices became clearer. "We're still here. Let us out," Mrs. Miller gasped, her hand covering her mouth. Suddenly something shifted on the screen. The camera caught movement, but it wasn't human. The wall, the uneven brick wall in the back corner, seemed to pulse, as if something behind it was alive, pressing against it, desperate to break free. Then from one of the cameras, the faint outline of a figure appeared, almost translucent, emerging from the wall itself. It was a person, or at least, it had once been. Their face was gaunt, hollow eyes filled with terror and pain. More figures followed, all of them drifting through the basement, their mouths open in silent screams. Kyle stood up, nearly knocking over his chair. What is that?" he stammered. But the figures didn't just hover. They moved toward the camera, closer and closer, their faces twisted in anguish. One reached out, its pale hand almost brushing the lens. "We were trapped, tortured. Please, help us." The camera feed flickered, and suddenly the room was filled with high-pitched, ear-piercing screams. The voices on the screen grew louder, overlapping, drowning each other out, as if all the spirits were crying out at once. It became too much to bear. The family leapt from their seats, frantically shutting off the equipment. But the voices didn't stop. They were no longer coming from the camera. They were coming from the walls, from the floor. from all around them. Desperate to understand what they were dealing with, Mr. Miller spent the next day at the local library, combing through old records. What he discovered chilled him to the bone. The house had once belonged to a notorious figure, a man named Arthur Blackwell, who had been arrested decades earlier for running a secret underground facility beneath the house. People had disappeared, transients, workers, even neighbors, and it was rumored that they were taken to the basement, where they were tortured in ways too horrible to speak of. None of the bodies were ever found. The brick wall in the basement had been hastily added when the house changed owners, a cover-up for the atrocities that had happened there. But the souls of the tortured never left. Their cries for help had been echoing for years, unheard by the living, until now. The Millers knew what they had to do. They had to free them. That night, armed with hammers and crowbars, the family descended into the basement. The air was thick with tension. Each step echoed as if the house itself was aware of their presence. They went straight for the brick wall, knowing that behind it lay the final resting place of the tortured souls. As they smashed through the wall, a foul odor seeped out, and the cries grew louder, more desperate. Behind the bricks, they found an old hidden room, lined with rusted chains and dark stains on the floor. There were no bodies, only shadows of what had been. "We're sorry," Mrs. Miller whispered, tears in her eyes. In that moment, the cries stopped. The air in the basement shifted, becoming lighter, less oppressive. The figures they had seen on the camera appeared again, but this time their faces were calm. One by one they faded, their presence dissipating into the air, as if they were finally at peace. The Millers stood in silence, the weight of the house's dark past lifting. That night, for the first time since they moved in, the house was quiet. The restless souls were free. But every now and then, when the wind blew just right, the Millers could still hear faint echoes from below, a reminder of the horrors that had once been buried there, and a warning that some things, no matter how hidden, can never truly be forgotten.